Hi, this is Karen from Soterion, and you're listening to the SAP Security and GRC podcast, helping you in your journey to effective access risk management in SAP. In today's episode, we explore a critical question: do the benefits of job role standardization in SAP outweigh the potential drawbacks? Our host is Dudley Cartwright, and he'll be joined by Mutsaers from trax and Emile Steyn from Soterion. Thank you for joining us.
Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to today's podcast, where we're going to discuss and debate the topic around: do the benefits of job role standardization outweigh the drawbacks? And especially as organizations move into the S4 and RISE with SAP era, or do organizations need to reevaluate or reconsider their entire approach to job role standardization? So I'm joined today by Mutsaers from trax and Emile Steyn from Soterion. Roy, hi, welcome. The first time you've joined us on one of these shows. Thank you very much. If you just want to let everyone know who you are and who you work for.
Yeah. Thank you, Dudley. Roy Mutsaers. I'm director of trax the Netherlands since June last year. I have a background in SAP security for, I think, 15 years already. Worked for Big Four. I have an IT audit background and worked into the cyber domain as well, all in relation with SAP. So thank you for having me. Trax. We're already around since the 1990s, more or less, really focusing on security and authorizations as a whole. But I think our core business is really redefining authorization concepts, RBAC concepts, as well as cybersecurity for SAP, and implement tooling around security, governance, risk, and compliance. So I think we served over 200 mid and large size companies since our existence. So we are here for a while already. Yeah.
And you obviously come with a lot of experience. So we're very happy to have you on the show. Thank you. Okay. So to begin, Emile, I'll possibly ask you to kick us off. Maybe let's just explain what do we mean by job role standardization, and maybe let's you can also just cover what are some of the historical benefits or advantages of standardizing your job roles.
Thanks, Dudley. Yeah, standardization. The idea is that every user that has the same job function ideally needs exactly the same access. So what companies want to achieve through that is effectively to streamline the joiner, mover, leaver process. So if someone joins the company, they are joining in the job title as an accountant. The authorization administrator knows exactly what role to give, potentially through the use of composite roles or business roles. So there are different ways in how to standardize access, but effectively they'll know exactly what role to give. And the same thing when a person moves from one job function to another. So for companies that want to streamline that process and also look at automating, that has always been kind of the best way to do it, because it's very easy then to determine what is the access that go with that either new user or that change. So the argument has also been that I don't want to say it improves governance, but it maybe simplifies governance, and that relates to other items like the user access review, for instance. So where there's a requirement typically for companies that need to be SOX or JSOX compliant, then they need to review user access. So if I need to do a review, I'll do a review to say this user is the accountant. And for the line manager reviewing that becomes a very simple process. They just need to confirm that that person is indeed an accountant, where the more technical review of the role content lies with the technical people responsible for the roles itself. So that in short is kind of what companies do with standardization, and some of the benefits. I'm sure there are maybe a couple of others, but those are kind of the core ones that the companies focus on.
Yeah. So thanks for that. And so you just mentioned how it's an important business objective there. Is it fair to say that we've seen that it seems to be a more important business objective for some of the larger organizations? The smaller the organizations, they can maybe get away with not needing to standardize. But as the organizations get larger and you have 10, 15, 20,000 sort of SAP users, the tendency to standardize, the benefits definitely seem to increase the larger the organization gets.
Yeah, definitely. So I think great point. The larger the organization, the more changes there are, the more joiners, the more movers, the more leavers. So that actually has quite a big cost benefit because the maintenance from the authorization administrator is a lot less. So if those were direct assignments, the amount of effort that will take to assign access to users will be a lot more. So there's potentially a big cost saving for companies if that is a much simpler process to onboard the users as well.
Yeah, okay, no, perfect. Okay, Roy, over to you. Maybe now let's look at the other side of the coin. Can you just share with us what you see as some of the challenges or some of the sort of negatives or downsides associated with job role standardization?
Yeah, you see that in a lot of organizations, it's very difficult. Either roles are standardized to really getting control of your risks. It may lead to broader segregation of duty conflicts as you standardize. Because in some real use cases with standardization, if you give everybody the same access and only one person in a department is using certain critical access and the other 9 don't, then it's very difficult to in one way to explain why that is, and the second to get in control and stay in control about the assignments and apply correct mitigating controls. Another thing is that, and especially with RISE in the pipeline, is that the license model of SAP is going to change. So with standardization, and especially in the case that I just mentioned, then it could be that you are overpaying licenses for a certain functionality that only one person is using within a department.
That's a very important point, because what we see is that, as you correctly mentioned there, unfortunately, the downside to standardization is that users generally end up with more access assigned to them than what they would have got if roles were assigned directly to the user. And that's just through, as you mentioned there, the tendency to say, if you've got 10 accounts payable clerks and 2 of those are sort of slight outliers and they're performing slightly different functionality, what generally is the approach is people will go and build a sort of job role that encompasses all of those 10 users' access, meaning that the other 8 inherit access that they don't need. And so I think a lot of organizations accepted that additional risk from an access risk perspective. But as you correctly mentioned there, it was going to be very interesting to see if companies are going to be willing to accept that over-assignment when it has a financial impact from a licensing perspective. So that's going to be, I agree, that's going to be very interesting to see. Maybe just before we move off some of the negatives, Roy, something that we've seen that companies struggle with job role standardization is, one is just the source data. A lot of the time when you define your job roles, you base that on like an HR position, but the HR positions are quite different to what people are doing in SAP. So there's not a great correlation with that, which ends up meaning that when you group those users together, because they're doing quite different things in SAP, those roles get quite large. And then, Emile, maybe also ask you guys to chip in on this. There's another challenge that we've seen is just remediating access with a job role design can be more challenging because unfortunately you're not always, if you're bringing in usage data to say, well, what can I take away from the user? You've got to be thinking about, all the users assigned to that job role and not a user in isolation. So unfortunately, some cleanup remediation activities, would you agree, could be more challenging with sort of a job role sort of approach?
I'll give you the first opportunity to answer, and then I'll fill in the gaps if I see any.
Yeah. I think the difficulty here is from a traditional way, we start with gathering the data and again build the roles. I think we now need to add maybe additional data on the side of who did actually what. More that we go to a did-do analysis besides only looking at who executed which transaction codes. It's a good starting point, but I think we need more data properly analyze that.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. It's building those job roles based on HR job titles rather than using the data and basing it on what people are using. It's a good point there.
So I'll maybe touch on the remediation portion. So there are different ways in how companies standardize access. So it's not to get into a debate of role methodologies, but you can have composite roles, you can have a single role that has been built for a specific job, or you can have a business role concept. But if we use the example, for instance, of the composite role, a composite role would be used to assign to many different people. So to then afterwards try and remove one of the single roles that make up that composite role because 9 of the 10 users are not using it. But what is the design decision that you're going to take to assign that one role back to the user that actually needs that access to perform their job function? And I think that's also where companies, Dudley, as you said, they struggle to justify it from a risk perspective, and they said we rather live with the additional access risk. But I think what we see now is with licensing that will potentially change, and companies will rethink how they standardize access. And if that means either standardizing at a more granular level and creating additional job functions potentially that a role matches what that user specifically is doing, or maybe a smaller subset of users are doing, that might be one of the approaches that they take, or potentially move to something that can be flexible like a business role. But for that, you potentially need software to facilitate the process.
I think then that leads us very nicely then, Emile, into the next section. Roy, you correctly, highlighted the impact of licensing. So let's explore that a bit. So those challenges that we've discussed that are associated with job role standardization, where people are assigned wider access, so that impacts the amount of access risk, and it also has a potential impact on the amount of increasing the number of civil licenses that you need, more full use equivalent licenses. So as companies move into this S4 world, and with the introduction of the STAR measurement program, is there the potential that the licensing cost implication can negate all the benefits that were once sort of achieved by or through the business, the job role standardization? And is this going to be enough of a sort of deterrent for organizations to think, listen, we've got to rethink our entire job role strategy, design, and approach? And so I think, when we talk about an organization's job role strategy, I think we need to look at it from two aspects. One is the design. Emile, as you correctly say there, what is the degree of standardization that's acceptable to the organization without overinflating the number of risks and or full use equivalent licenses? And then secondly, also the approach or the method, which is the system that's going to be the sort of owner or custodian of the business roles? Is it an access control solution, or is it potentially an IGA solution? And is there maybe going forward, or companies going to need to revisit this approach and say, well, listen, we might need to shift where these business roles are created and defined because of the potential cost implication of getting it wrong. Okay, but there's a lot to cover there. I think, Roy, before we've just mentioned the introduction of the STAR measurement program, and in case anyone listening is not quite familiar with that, may I ask you, just cover a little bit about what's changed from SAP user licensing from ECC moving into S4 in particular with the STAR measurement program.
So I think basically the easiest to explain is that I think in the past you were allowed to do a measurement and provide the details to SAP. Say this is a limited advanced user, this is an advanced user, this is a developer user. Now with RISE and potentially in the future maybe with on-premise as well, but we don't know that yet. The measurement is done upfront based on who has access to what, and not anymore to who did what. So the importance of a well-defined role concept is getting very big for your licensing, and that is a real change in this. Yeah.
And Emile, we've spoken offline about this, where a lot of companies over assignment of access resulted in additional risk. A lot of organizations didn't do much about it because they would still look at that and say, well, for someone to still commit fraud, they still need to know that they've got conflicting access. They've got to know how to use each of those conflicting functions. And it's an illegal activity, so there's a lot of sort of natural deterrents to committing fraud. But from a licensing perspective, as Roy says there, the minute someone has got an authorization object field or activity that means that user or that role is a sort of an advanced full use equivalent, that is automatic. Those people are then classified accordingly. There's no ifs and buts. So it is now very important that from a licensing perspective that companies really, really do need to consider this approach, because the potential cost implication can be far, far significant to any potential fraudulent incident. So companies might need to just change their mindset with this and saying, listen, we're doing this to address licensing. It's not saying that access risk is not important. It will always remain hugely, hugely important. But the reality is we might see companies starting to place more emphasis on the potential cost implication of getting this wrong from a licensing perspective. So, Emile, maybe just if you want to just talk through about what are the options available from a design perspective. You mentioned earlier about the different degrees of standardization. Like what would that mean, and how would you sort of go about working that out?
Yeah, I also maybe want to just add to what Roy said there on the impact of the licenses. So also maybe just give a practical example. So let's say if there's a change request coming in from one user, and I'll continue with the example of the accountant, and he wants to add maybe an additional transaction. So an additional transaction is added to the role. Those call some of the authorizations that's in the STAR measurement program, and that access gets added to a single role, and that single role is part of the composite role that goes to all of the users that is assigned to the accountant role. So any small change has an immediate knock-on effect on all those users from a licensing perspective. So now where we then look at the kind of degree of the standardization, this is now where we can, as Roy also pointed out, we need to analyze the usage data of these users. What are they actually doing in the system? So for those users that are doing something slightly different, or maybe they are based somewhere else and they need some additional functionality, for instance. So we see that very often, that smaller companies or smaller environments require one person to do something slightly more. So for scenarios like that, it might be better to create a separate composite role or separate standardization for those users that do something slightly different, and only assign to them the access that they need. And the other users that is doing everything the same, they can keep the original accountant composite, where the new users might get the accountant special role as an example. Yeah. So, and that will mean those users, the users that keep the original one is not affected with first of all, the licensing impact, but also not affected potentially by the additional access risk impact. And I think that's where companies will need to weigh up what are the benefits they get from that. Is the cost saving from a licensing perspective? Is that enough compared to the additional maintenance that might go with that?
Yeah, so what you're saying there is just, as you say, possibly be more granular with how you define your business roles or your job roles, and maybe leaning more to saying, listen, let's be a little bit more sort of accurate with our job roles and not create these fewer broad roles. Let's create more that provide that group of users with that. Yeah, so I guess then, as you say, then is then just doing the cost benefit analysis and saying, okay, well, if we standardize to this degree, it's going to cost us X in licenses. If we standardize to this degree, it's going to cost us Y in licenses. At what point does it make financial sense to the benefits or the cost saving that standardization, possibly brings about? Okay, so moving then on to the approach, Roy, what we've seen is some of the bigger companies have implemented some IGA solutions that define the business roles. Do you think that if some of those IGA solutions don't have great access risk capabilities or don't have great licensing capabilities, would there be an argument for some organizations to say, listen, let's move that business role concept out of the IGA solution, and we handle that within the sort of access control solution if it has those capabilities to measure that, and almost come up. We're interested to see if a sort of a hybrid approach to organizations where the IGA solution handles all the non-SAP systems and the access control solution handles all the SAP sort of systems, because of the access controls capabilities with access risk as well as licensing. Have you got any thoughts on whether you see movement in that space in the coming years?
Yeah, definitely. In my practice, I believe that you can handle identities and the governance of corporate identities in an IGA, but the SAP space remains. I don't want to call it a niche, but the IGA people, they often don't understand the granularity in SAP to make proper decisions. So, in my belief, if we look at it from an architectural point of view, then I think you cannot avoid having a specific governance and access management solution for SAP, maybe on top of your IGA or connected to your IGA. So you can do the risk analysis in a dedicated solution, but you can handle the join and move a lever as such in an IGA. And that's a thing I believe. Separating those worlds is possible, but in my opinion, I would say, okay, keep the SAP-related work to the SAP team, but make a connection to your corporate IGA so that the PML is properly handled, and also the identity governance is properly handled in an IGA.
So I think we're all preaching from the same sheet here, because we agree 100% with you there, Roy. I think maybe it's going to become our responsibility in the coming years to educate, organizations about the challenges of, one approach over another approach. So I think there is quite a big education activity that will need to happen where we explain, exactly what you've just said. I think maybe then sort of starting to get to the end of this session, if a company was to come to either of you two and say, listen, we're about to embark on our S4 journeys, what are the things we need to consider? What is the approach or the recommendations we'll give a company that has the luxury of sort of doing this with a blank canvas, and what would we say to them to get a sort of a design in place that is going to allow them to achieve all their objectives? One of those objectives being, listen, we want a low amount of access risk violations. We want to ensure that we don't significantly overpay for licenses. So trying to encompass all of that, what would be some considerations for good strategy when migrating to RISE, RISE with SAP? As we know now, it's now SAP Cloud ERP Private, to balance those benefits of, that come with job role standardization with the potential downsides of that. Okay, open to any of you guys. If there's anything you think we haven't covered already that we can add to this.
I have some real scenario cases, and if you're migrating to RISE, start with analyzing what you have. Look at your current concept. Is it feasible to transform that to RISE? Not only from a license perspective, also from an access management perspective, and even from a Fiori side, because also that comes into play. It's becoming more and more complex. It's not a lift and shift approach, in my opinion. So see what you have, but also start, if you have certain access management tooling, GRC tooling, or even the STAR report, run it on your current concept. But maybe also ask for assistance there in a way that if you share it already with SAP, then they already know the quality of your concept. So there I would recommend have a look at it and then decide how to continue. What is the license impact if we continue this way? So that are the most important things. And then in a lot of cases, you see that either way, some sort of redesign is required because the concept polluted over time. A lot of access is everywhere, basically, which directly impacts your licenses as well as your access risks. So my advice is to do some sort of quick scan or audit or whatever you want to call it on your current concept, review it. Is it feasible for S4 on all the areas we just mentioned?
Yeah, no, perfect. Well, I think that's very good points there. Thank you. Emile, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think to add on to what Roy is saying, is very important to understand what your current situation is, and is that design feasible? And as Roy said, it's becoming a lot more complex, and there's a lot more layers to handle with Fiori apps, catalogs, pages, spaces. What's the end user experience going to be? So there are many considerations, but I think in analyzing also the existing design, you also need to use the data analytics to understand what users are exactly using, so that you know what is that difference between what is currently assigned versus what users are actually using. And then you can have a discussion on what is that middle ground between what they have at the moment versus what they are using, and what is the design that can get us to the point that we are comfortable with. So both from an access risk perspective, from a licensing perspective, also keeping in the additional maybe transformation or changes of the business processes that you might undergo. Where will you be comfortable in landing in this S4 transformation? And then maybe just speaking in again to the standardization, I think that's also where you can then decide, what areas of my business can I actually standardize access, because certain departments will lend itself to easier standardization than others. So, and also in those, let's say someone in the warehouse, for instance, they would be less access risk, but there's also potentially less of a license impact if there's overassignment. So look at your kind of specific department, and that can also drive the standardization decision. So for those users, you might have one role that's a good fit for everyone, where in finance, there might be users that do something slightly different than the person sitting next to them. So there you might need to follow a higher degree of standardization.
Yeah, no, perfect. I think, again, Emile, some very good points there. And I think maybe just from my side, just trying to add to both what you and Roy have said there. I think organizations must not underestimate the amount of time they may need to resolve some of these issues. So, Roy, you mentioned there that start with a scan, a brilliant starting point. The company understand what is the impact going to be if they don't do anything. The scan will also highlight, okay, well, we do need to do something, but what is that? Is that a role cleanup? Is that a role redesign? So don't underestimate. Leave yourself with a lot of preparation time. Don't start trying to look at this 1 month before you're moving to RISE. Start with this a year in advance. You give yourself enough time to address these issues, because some of them might be lengthy role cleanup type projects. And then just secondly, if you get this wrong, there's a huge potential cost implication with this. So I think we've got to highlight the importance of the expertise you get to help you with this. I think if companies just go to the big system integrators and there's not a big focus on security, they may end up paying a lot more in licenses than they would want. So this is my punt to engaging with a company like Axel and Trax, who this is what they do. They know the different role designs, the different methodologies. They know what that a particular type of solution is going to end up costing you from a risk perspective, from a licensing perspective. So I think there should be also consideration for engaging with the specialists in this space, because getting this wrong can just have such a significant cost implication on the organization. Roy, thank you very, very much for joining us. We really appreciate your thoughts and your expertise. Emile, as always, thank you. Okay, to everyone, until the next podcast, thank you for joining.